You're watching a production of South Dakota Public Broadcasting.
Let's tell you about the size
These are pictures of Earth taken by satellites in space and transmitted to the Eros Data Center north of Sioux Falls. This photo shows part of North America. At first glance, it may seem something's missing. Lines marking the borders between nations, in this case between Canada and the United States. And between the states. South Dakota's borders would be just about here. Of course, nothing's really missing on the photos. Border lines are seen on maps, not painted across the countryside, but that doesn't mean they're not real. Wars have been fought over where borders should be, and if your house sits on this side of the road sign, you'll vote and pay taxes in South Dakota. Those houses just down the road are homes to Iowans, who vote and pay taxes in that state. South Dakota borders are real and exact, and sometimes people talk as if the state has existed within these lines forever. That's not the case. France and Spain are European nations, far across the Atlantic, but there were times when their kings considered today's South Dakota to be their land. And a time when the United States worried that Britain might make a grab for our rivers and prairies. Say Louisiana today, and folks think of New Orleans, Mardi Gras, and alligators. But once, Louisiana's borders reached far to the north and took in today's South Dakota. And later the land called Dakota included Yellowstone country and part of the Rocky Mountains. All of which goes to prove, given that mountains and geysers don't change locations, borders do. Some of what we know about distant nations once claiming this countryside is because of 5 Fort Pierre teenagers. Walking near the Missouri River in 1913, they discovered an 8-inch by 6-inch metal plate put there in 1743. The plate was a marker left by French fur trappers, led by 2 brothers named La Vérendrye. The marker claimed the land for King Louis of France. Of course, these Frenchmen, and other Europeans later, knew the land to be home to American Indian people who lived in villages along the rivers or in camps that moved across the prairies. We know some Europeans believed American Indians had the right to claim land ownership because money and goods were often traded for those lands. But again and again, that caused confusion because most American Indian groups didn't think of land as something that could be owned. These people pulled fish from the Missouri River and hunted bison across a big patch of the prairie. They fought other people to keep them away from their villages and from the fish and bison. And they made trades, like horses or bags of flour, in exchange for fishing and hunting. But it seems strange to think of the land itself as something to be traded, or to be divided on maps with exact borders. Surveyors eventually arrived, with instruments that calculated border locations right down to yards and feet. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, fur traders and explorers made their way up and down the Missouri River, and sometimes across the prairies. The region was also getting attention from the world's map makers. First, just as the La Vérendrye brothers claimed, maps showed today's South Dakota to be French country, named Louisiana after France's King Louis. But then France went to war with Britain, and the French king worried he couldn't defend his property way off in the middle of North America. He turned to a cousin for help, a cousin who happened to be King of Spain. The deal was, Spain could consider our region its own until France was ready to take it back. The best remembered Spanish figure from that time is Manuel Lisa, who explored and mapped rivers and later started a successful fur trading company. he often traded seeds and farming tools to American Indians in exchange for furs. By the time the French were ready to reclaim the land from Spain in 1802, two revolutions had greatly changed world maps. The First Revolution established the United States as a nation, and the young country claimed land from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. The Second Revolution was an uprising in France that ended that nation becoming a kingdom. Instead of a king, the French leader who took back the North American property was Napoleon Bonaparte, emperor and general, never shy about going to war to advance French interests. Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States, could look at a map and see a war-minded neighbor like Napoleon might be a problem. So Jefferson took action, offering to buy Louisiana for $11 million. Napoleon accepted because his wars left him with lots of bills to pay. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase made the United States a much bigger country. After Lewis and Clark explored the new property for President Jefferson between 1804 and 1806, providing new details for map makers, Americans began thinking of how the United States might grow bigger still. It could stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, especially if another European nation, Britain, kept the borders of its North American lands far to the north. South Dakotans usually think of the War of 1812 between the United States and Britain as happening in the eastern United States, where the British burned the White House, and where Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner as he watched a battle at Baltimore. But British success in the War of 1812 might have meant border changes out west, with today's South Dakota becoming British land. As it turned out, neither Britain nor the United States could claim a clear victory in the war. In the end, leaders of the two nations sat down and drew a border between their lands, about 200 miles north of today's South Dakota, now the United States-Canada border. For much of the 1800s, the land that would become South Dakota was a territory, part of the United States, but without enough people to function as a state. At first, Dakota Territory's borders took in today's North and South Dakota, plus big parts of modern-day Wyoming and Montana. Within territory borders were other borders, marking reserved lands or reservations for American Indians. In the thinking of settlers and the United States government in the 1800s, moving American Indians onto reservations was a step toward building farms and towns on lands these people left. About the time Abraham Lincoln became president in 1861, talk began about moving enough settlers into Dakota Territory to make it a state. In fact, John Todd, cousin of President Lincoln's wife, was among the first to work for the establishment of towns and farmlands in the territory. By 1874, when territory leaders first made a push for statehood, Dakota Territory had been reduced in size to the land that's today's North and South Dakota. Most people believed this area would become one new state. But statehood didn't happen quickly. Settlement was slower than leaders hoped. In Washington, D.C., the Democrat and Republican parties worried that new states would upset the political balance in Congress. Later, leaders in Dakota Territory and Washington, D.C. discussed possibilities for two states, perhaps divided east and west, or north and south. And they discussed the possibility of a state to be named for President Lincoln with borders around the Black Hills region. At first, Dakota Territory's capital was Yankton. Politicians from the north didn't like traveling so far to the capital on the territory's southern border. In 1883, the Northerners were successful in getting the capital moved to Bismarck. Now, those in the South complained about distance. There were other hard feelings and matters of disagreement between Southern and Northern Dakotans. Southern Dakotans believed they were more committed about holding on to school lands used to raise education money. Southerners worried the wealthy Northern Pacific Railroad, running across the northern part of the territory, gave that region too much political power. Northerners pointed out that perhaps the South's bigger population gave it unfair political strength. The two sides worried less about each other after President Benjamin Harrison signed papers establishing two new states, South Dakota and North Dakota, in 1889. South Dakota's borders have remained the same ever since. Even a surveyor's mistake along the western border that gave Montana a little more land than originally planned has not been corrected. But the borders marking reservation lands have been anything but unchanging.
Originally, it was based on the Fort Laramie 1868 treaty in which boundaries were drawn, which housed basically the Lakota Nation. And then later, especially with the discovery of gold in the Black Hills in 1874, there was a push, by non-Indians to want to possess that land themselves, especially the Black Hills. Eventually, a line was drawn on the 104th meridian, which conveniently chopped off the Black Hills. And so that left the boundary over to the east bank of the Missouri River out to the edge of the Black Hills. The remaining land would be affected by the Allotment Act of 1889 and 1887, actually. And so really it was to break up tribal land holdings. On the other hand, it sounds like, well, you're getting something because they're giving each adult male a quarter section of land. So once those allotments were made, there was this surplus land left over, and they said, well, everybody's got their land, They never thought about future generations, so that's where the Homestead Act come in. They said the surplus land on the reservation will now be it became the Homestead Act, and you could come in and as a farmer, say, and farm your land and build a schoolhouse and different things like that and receive this land. So it was very devastating, to the Lakota.
Like reservations, South Dakota counties are defined by borders. City limits are borders telling us who lives or works within a community and who's in the rural countryside. And while all these borders are indeed real, it's good to look at an AROS photo once in a while. And be reminded that in our part of the world, borders aren't barriers. We're free to cross them as we wish, as we explore all corners of South Dakota and beyond.
For additional information, a teacher's guide, games, quizzes, and more, log on to dakotapathways.org.